Hey everyone. This paper was one I presented at the British Society of Criminology meet at University of Strathclyde in Glasgow earlier on this month. Um, it's a paper that situates the policing of Black young people in Wellingborough during the 70s and 80s, not only as something done by the local police department, but also the institution of education, so schools as well. I, I take the term policing as a verb that can be practiced by anyone in that context. So it's not just about the police, but the idea of policing individuals and bodies and so on. And I mainly talk about schools in Wellingborough in this context and also the local shopping centre. The context, because not everyone knows, Wellingborough is a town in Northamptonshire in the East Midlands within England. And this paper is largely drawn from um, first generation of Black British people who were children in Wellingborough in that era, as well as white people who were in Black spaces doing what we would call community work under a wider rubric of activism. I focus on Wellingborough to archive one story of over policing in that area, since when it comes to over policing Black communities, at least in fast films, TV, and really writing about it, the narrative has been eclipsed by major English cities, notably uprisings against police racism in London, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, and so on. So focusing on this East Midlands town takes us out of these built-up cities and into provincial England, where in the late 60s and early 70s at least, may have been seen as quite a rural area, even if they were definitionally towns. So in 1965, the newly prior introduced Race Relations Act, which on paper criminalised racism in public spaces, led to the formation of a Community Race Council Board. This board greenlit funding to make community relations councils, so CRCs across England, included towns like Northampton and Wellingborough. Mike Prescott, who came from Barbados, came to England from Barbados in the 60s, moved to Wellingborough from Coventry prior serving in the army, becoming the town's first Black social worker in 1976, working for Northamptonshire County Council. He was the first paid worker at Wellingborough and District Community Relations Council as well. From the 70s, he, along with Billy Walker, who was also from Barbados, and also Merlin Francisque, who I think may have been from Jamaica, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I still need to check that. Were running Saturday schools from home in response to the issue of educationally subnormal and special schools pervading mainstream education at the time. To explain that, so in the 60s and 70s Britain, hundreds of thousands of Black children of Caribbean heritage were labelled educationally subnormal by the state and wrongly sent to what the Department of Education at the time called special schools, for children deemed with low intelligence, the impact of which we are still seeing today. During the 70s, there were so-called academics that produced theories equating to a race of intelligence. Such people included Hans Eysenck, whose work built on earlier colonial thinking that positioned Black people as less able than white people. His theories were not thought of as controversial, but by the wider white population, but entirely normal for the racist Britain of the time. Many sensitive challenged the status quo. In a Northampton context, a town near to Wellingborough, Black children that was not quiet and compliant are more likely to end up in these classes. Sarah Berry, who was working at Northampton Community Relations Council in 1975 as a community relations officer, told me that Bayesian children were way ahead of the English kids, which really upset some schools, end quote. The education system and curriculum in Barbados were ahead. Bayesian children were made to redo a year in some cases. Children who had arrived traumatized and thrown into this bleak, dark country and its schools. They were made to redo classes, so they acted out in some cases. The schools then saw them as uncompliant, um, and were policed by the institution itself. Paul Crofts arrived in Wellingborough during the very early 80s, around 1982, and remembers one of the biggest issues facing the black community being schools. He was a white man who had grown up in Leicester, radicalized into anti-racist work by the racism faced by the Asian community during the 60s. And he was in school when the Kenya Asian crisis broke, and this all-white secondary school suddenly had numbers of Asian students being bussed into it. This was when Leicester City Council had a busing policy for newly arrived immigrant children from the area they were living, mostly from the Belgrave area in Leicester. So no surprise they were attacked, spat at, beaten up, going to and from the buses. Paul then I was aged around 15, 16 and became aware. So that was his wake-up call to that racism existed in his community and in Britain at large. He would then be in fights with the racist kids, along with his white friends. Um, and that was his introduction into racism on the front lines in Leicester. Paul later got involved in the anti-apartheid movement and the Communist Party, and later worked for the National Union of Students, the NUS, when it was a left-wing organisation. At that time, the international department were involved in issues in Chile and South Africa, and the now famous Trevor Phillips was the elected vice president at the time, and Paul was the officer that worked for him. After working at the NUS, Paul went to work at Ealing Community, Community Relations Council, and it was here he met Audrey Doogie and Ziggy Alexander, who did the first book on Mary Seacole. It was here he developed his interest in Black history, which saw him later be involved in Northampton Black history research, which is another story in of itself. Anyhow, came to Wellingborough in 82 to work at this very provincial Community Relations Council. His point of contact was Mike Prescott. So getting that job, he soon saw the racism in schools, notably Weaver's School, which is still there, and so now it's called Weaver's Academy. Paul told me that in those days, most of the black kids went to Weaver's, and there were big issues of exclusions and unfair disciplinary action against them. I can remember having meetings with the head and deputy head, not pleasant characters, he said. They weren't interested in issues of race and racism, and didn't see what they were doing in any way wrong. There was quite a bit of conflict between Wellingborough African Caribbean Association, so the WACA Centre on Lock Street, and also alongside with Wellingborough Community Relations Council, so the Wellingborough CRC. So those two groups were working together, and they had conflicts with Weaver's School, which is now Weaver's Academy. Within that, many of these children being put into these special classes were victim to what we now call adultification. Today, the concept has re-emerged in child welfare spaces, notably after the case of Child Q came to public attention. Although adultification has been discussed across literature going back to the 1990s, I looked to Janine Davis and Nicholas Marsh's definition of adultification as when notions of innocence and vulnerability are not afforded to certain children. This is determined by people and institutions who hold power over them. When adultification occurs outside the home, it is always found within discrimination and bias. There are various definitions of adultification, all relate to a child's personal characteristics, socioeconomic influences, and/or lived experiences. Regardless of the context in which it takes place, the impact results in children's rights being either diminished or not upheld, which is why we often discuss the adultification of Black children, especially in schools and at the hands of police as well. This is also common in policing contexts going back to the 70s. For example, Northampton MP Tony Marlow at the time advocating for the use of paramilitary troopers against Black youth in London during the Brixton uprisings, many of whom would have been under the age of 18. probably adolescent teens as well. The special schools scandal was compounded by violent cultures of policing, including when the Arndale Centre, so a shopping centre, was built around 77, which became the Swansgate Centre, and became a hangout for many black youngsters, especially young black boys. In 1980, a white woman, Jenny Lawrence, was working at a legal firm on Silver Street um, called Smith Chamberlain. Their main office was Regent House on the corner of Oxford Street and Silver Street. She was a criminal lawyer and began to have lots of black clients due to the racist police practices against Wellingborough black context. Um, this is where Wacker is, um, and that's Jenny's here. So that there's Oxford Street, Silver Street cross here, and then the shopping centre's here, and then the Wellingborough CRC is all over here. So this is this is the town, and everything is very close together. Um, this is a Google Maps representation as well, so some things might not be strictly geographically accurate, but I think this is a general sense of what it may have been may have looked. Um, Jenny told me about how on weekday afternoons around 4 p.m., black youngsters were normally deciding how they wanted to spend the evening. This was routine. This was routine. On this afternoon in particular, there was a young white man shoplifting in Boots Chemist. CCTV had just been installed in the centre, and the police arrested the black kids, 37 of them, who had gathered outside Boots watching the commotion inside. The violent policing culture related to what was happening in the Arndale Centre. Centre management were targeting black youth and calling the police on them if they were hanging out in the centre because they may or may not have been stealing stuff. Often retailers would get calls from the centre management saying black kids were stealing. Centre management and the police really just didn't like black children very much, and this was a classic example. If there was any black kids in the centre, the managers would ring round all the shops and telephone the police. The police would then go around the shops saying, "Watch out for those black kids." Around that time in the early 80s, Paul Crofts remembers there being a so-called mini riot with some of the black kids running from Boots in the Arndale Centre. They were chased by the police and they made a number of arrests at the centre. So Jenny Lawrence told a similar story, which is one I've just told, um, with the added context that a police officer had assaulted a black child outside of Boots. So the CCTV showed him outside Boots assaulting one of the 37 kids that Jenny talked about. So the running Paul describes was probably in response to police violence, and the police described it as a riot to anyone that would listen. Around this time, Paul also told me that there were rogue elements of Wellingborough's black community who were more conservative. Jenny's work came under criticism from parts of that community. As Paul said, they believed Jenny was encouraging the black kids, to be criminals. She was always defending them and getting them off in court. A brilliant solicitor or criminal lawyer, and way ahead of Wellingborough police and the magistrate. And these kids would always be found not guilty. Paul says some elements of the more conservative parts within the black community thought these kids were out of order and ought to be locked up. So there's that whole idea of law and order going on here as well. So that notion of criminalising black youth for standing around was not something specific to Northamptonshire, but was nationwide, as we know from what's been written about the city. In Northampton and Wellingborough, there was a lot of racist stereotyping on this regard. A guy called Ian Sinclair was in a police station one time and discovered an internal memo that identified and targeted a whole load of black kids under the age of 16. It caused a huge row with the police and it went public. Likewise, black Caribbean youths were treated in the same way with the Grosvenor Centre in Northampton, which was a new build as well, around 1974. They would often be hanging around there as they had nowhere to go. And this is what led them to self-organizing and forming the Matafankanta youth movement in 77, which was a Rastafarian-led youth centre, but was inclusive of everyone. Many of these kids would have been victimized by the prior subnormal scandal as well. Um, so this paper was based on original interviews, um, part of a wider PhD study done on Caribbean Northants between 1948 and 85. These towns back then were less populated. There were fewer cars on the road. There were fewer buildings. It was, in some aspects, it was Black lives in the sticks. This was not Brixton, Moss Side, or Handsworth. For us, out in provincial England, by the 80s, anti-racism work was really mixed, which flies in the face of popular memory about the Windrush and the activist work of that era, most prominently on film and TV. And talking to people like Sarah Berry, they look back on that time with pride, showing they were on the right side of history. And thanks very much for listening. And if you're interested in this sort of stuff, give my page a follow, and I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments as well.